Okay, class. Just a couple housekeeping notes. Last week, I did a video on poverty, and for some reason, the flash drive didn't work, and I couldn't upload it for you. But anyway, just a few takeaways in terms of poverty. I wanted to make an important distinction relating to poverty based on some theoretical ideas first put forth by a very prominent 19th century economist, someone whose name you're all, I imagine, probably somewhat familiar with, and that's Karl Marx. Now, Marx generally is associated with communism and various totalitarian regimes that are still in existence, North Korea, Cuba, Vietnam, and a few others. Um, this particular economic idea really isn't inextricably linked to Marx's other more radical economic ideas, and that's Marx's distinction uh, in terms of the concept of poverty. Marx made a really important distinction that really holds well to this day, and that's the difference between what Marx called absolute deprivation versus relative deprivation. These were two types of poverty. One we could view as objective, namely um, absolute deprivation. So when Marx spoke about absolute deprivation, he's speaking of poverty that is clear cut, that we could say that in terms of a person being poor, that person is objectively poor, and that person is lacking one of the key components of just being well. What I mean by that is the person is lacking either in terms of food. The person doesn't have to be starving to death, but the person could be food insecure. Maybe, having to scramble to get the next meal. Or that person doesn't have sufficient shelter. Okay? They might be living in their car. They might be living, beneath a bridge. They might be, what we would say homeless. So they don't have the basics to get along. We could also throw in medical care, also. But of course, if you're not ill or injured, it's a little less relevant. But that would be another key component. Is not having adequate medical care being a key component of objective deprivation. On the other hand, when Marx spoke of the concept of relative deprivation, that's a term that applies not only to the poor, but people who might be considered even well off or even affluent. And what I mean by that is relative deprivation means that you're deprived compared to other people who are in close proximity to you. Let me give you an example of this. A few years ago, I was living in West Los Angeles, which is one of the more affluent parts of the greater Los Angeles area. I lived in Westwood, which is the UCLA campus, kind of wedged right between Beverly Hills and Brentwood. You might remember the Brentwood neighborhood as being the area that O.J. Simpson lived in. If you remember the 1990s and you followed the O.J. trial, you're familiar with the neighborhood of Brentwood. Well, very nice neighborhood, very expensive neighborhood. Well, if you're just a regular middle class, you have a decent job and you live in that area, you're not starving. You're doing actually pretty well. Okay? But compared to the people in, close proximity, you're poor. Okay? So we can think of it as being subjective poverty. You might not be you're not looking for your next meal. You're living in a decent house or apartment, but you're poor compared to other people around you. So that's absolute versus relative deprivation. Now, this week I wanted to talk about population, and probably the really important thing about population studies is the concept of demography. Demography is a subset of sociology that's concerned with population characteristics. And if you take a survey course in sociology, you'll be introduced to that concept, as well as this next important concept that really is important relative to the concept of population from a global perspective, and that's the concept of the demographic transition. And I have a chart here that illustrates the demographic transition. I hope it will all fit in the frame. So there are three main stages of the demographic transition. And when we think of the demographic transition, the essence of the demographic transition is it looks at population changes when a given society makes that transition from an agrarian or an agriculturally based society to an industrial society. So this was essentially what was going on in Europe, over the past few hundred years. So stage one is characteristic of an agrarian society, and we can look at this, the chart here. In stage one, and the red line represents the birth rate, and the charcoal line represents the death rate. So here, I hope you can see this. Here you see that both the birth rate and the death rate are both very high, so they kind of cancel each other out. There's not rapid population growth because even though there's a very high birth rate, there are a lot of babies being born, there's a very high death rate. Many of these babies die within the first 5 years of life. Infant mortality rates are very, very high. Okay, we can see at times that the death rate actually exceeds the birth rate. There might be a plague, or you can think in terms of the during medieval times in Europe, the bubonic plague, the Black Death. At a point in time in the 1200s, close to a quarter of the European population died from it. So the birth rate and the death rate, both very high. Fertility was very high. Agrarian or agriculturally based families tend to be huge because if you're working the fields, it doesn't cost very much to have a child, and once they're 7 or 8 years old, you can have them out working in the fields. Okay, now stage two, we can see here, deals with a transition where a society first discovers industry and the factory system. So what happens is the birth rate stays high. But then what happens is, during this stage, the death rate decreases significantly. A lot of that's due to the fact that the diet gets better. Certainly in Europe, people, in the 1500s were eating a better diet. A lot of that's related to exploration in the Western Hemisphere. They brought back staple crops like the potato, which were really good. You could store them in winter, and they had enough vitamin C that you wouldn't get scurvy, and it had other important nutrients in it that would prevent various deficiency diseases. But then we have stage three, and that's as a society really solidifies its economy in the industrial age. What happens is the birth rate starts going down, okay? And that's simply what happens once a society industrializes. When people move out of the farms and go to the factories in the cities, they tend to have fewer children. And a good explanation for that is, like, first of all, there were changes in the law. In the late 1800s, there were laws against child labor and laws relating to mandatory education for children. So instead of having kids work for the family, they were put in schools and they became more of an economic liability. In addition to that, if you move from a farm to the city, you actually have to pay for groceries, you have to pay for an apartment, and if you have like 10 children, you'd have to buy, a bigger apartment with more bedrooms, and it would, be a real drain on your finances. So it didn't make a whole lot of sense to do that. So we have a point in time, if we look at modern developed nations, many of them in Europe, like Germany and France, are actually losing population. Now, the people are staying, are living to a ripe old age on average, but they're having fewer children. So that's the concept of the demographic transition. It's, as I pointed out, a very important concept. If you take a sociology course, you'll be introduced to that. So I wanted to kind of give you a heads up on that. So, those things, as well as in the chapter, you're in good shape. So anyway, that's some of the basics on population. So just, keep the discussions, your weekly papers, and, of course, still continue working on your term papers that are going to be due at the end of the semester. So anyway, good luck.